Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to another episode of TFiR Insights. And today we have with us Jon Szymaniak, Principal Security Consultant with the NCC Group. John, first of all, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
If you look at security in general, things have changed now, but earlier security was always an afterthought. Nobody started writing their application or build their hardware with security in mind. And when we look at embedded devices, first of all, embedded space is a bit complicated space, right? The line between embedded and IoT is kind of blurring, but it's still, when you think about embedded space, it's even more challenging. Why? Depending on where you look at. If you look at consumer embedded, the way hardware cycles work, you sell the unit, you move on, you move to the next iteration of the hardware, you move to the next iteration of firmware, you don't even know who installed it, so you cannot even send the patches. So security was never at play there. But the role that embedded devices are playing in this world where everything in my house, for my smart fridge, to a speaker, to my ring, is connected. Any compromised system would compromise my whole network. So from you, what I want to understand is that, number one, are embedded people taking security seriously? Number one. Number two is, why should they?
In terms of are people taking it seriously, I think there is definitely a growing move towards making embedded security part of the process from day one in component selection, through design and architecture, all through implementation and then maintenance. But that being said, embedded systems have kind of seemingly lagged behind other technologies. When we think about all the great ways something like Android has grown in terms of its security posture over the years, and then we go open up any one given embedded device, we'll sometimes often see that they feel like they're still stuck in the 90s sometimes, right? So in my work, where I work with different companies to help them improve the security posture of the products, I can say that the appetite is there, but we still have a long way to go, and I think it's going to take product vendors wanting to improve their security posture. It's going to take people in the security community and in the open source communities to kind of want to push everyone to develop a good security posture. And it's going to take consumers and companies using these products to demand it. And in terms of why security matters, I think the points you made were excellent. We're taking technologies and integrating them into every part of our lives. And even if we buy a product, we pick it up off the shelf, and there are features, listed on that, we have the expectation that the device perform those features. But, there isn't necessarily all of the list of security considerations on that product. And we as consumers, especially in light of all these kind of data breaches and high profile threats that we're hearing more about, we have an expectation that we're going to remain secure. And as we integrate things into our lives more, or even our own personal safety is something that we want to be concerned about, not just compromise to our network, right? You had mentioned some smart home products. Now, if we think about how that impacts our lives, someone, being able to spy on us or our family, or to know when we are and are not home, those are real world things that affect us. And I think that ultimately what we need to begin thinking about is how these products are being used, and when we integrate technologies into our life, what are the real world risks? And let's think about those, from day one when we're thinking about an architecture or design, and go from there.
Now, there are 3 or 4 players here. Number one is users. Being a user myself, I have no hope that users will demand, because first of all, they don't know the risk. Number 2 is they want convenience. Like even my wife, sometimes she uses a password which is the simplest password. And when you add like 2-factor authentication, people don't want that because it's additional layer, so they won't go for it. And then, when you have people who are logged into Facebook all the time, you cannot expect privacy and security for them. But let's talk about the vendors. Let's talk about the companies. There should be some incentives for them, because as we were talking earlier, you sell one unit, you move on. You don't monetize from supporting that unit anymore. When I was going to buy even my smart TV or smart fridge, I don't want to name any company, but there is no mention for how long they will provide software updates to the fridge. I do know that there is 8 or 9 or whatever shelf life of that product. I do know the hardware warranty, but I have no idea for how long this device will get software updates. And this device is connected, as I said, to my home network. So looking at it realistically, if we do create some incentives for vendors, then they will look at security, keeping it patched, keeping updated as part of their business model. What do you think about that?
I think that makes sense, and I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of incentives are going to work, and how can we make it in everyone's best interest to build products that are secure? And like you mentioned, I think one of the failings we've had in just the security industry over the last number of years, decades, is putting that all onto the user rather than incentivizing the vendors to want to build secure products. And for instance, some of the things I'm seeing are like the IoT certifications, where, for instance, I think one of the requirements there is that a product must define to the consumer how long this product is going to receive security updates and what the end of life plan for that product is. How do you plan to remain secure when the product is kind of decommissioned and support wise? So perhaps one thing is just having these kind of labels that go on it that kind of says, yes, this has met this baseline. For those of us and your viewers who are interested and passionate about technology, pushing companies to publish and encouraging them to publish things like their white papers about their security models and things like that. I've seen that for a few recent projects coming out of some bigger companies. My favorite password manager publishes white papers detailing how this all works. So if we can find ways to kind of promote those excellent things that companies do, and in a way that promotes the products, perhaps maybe that'll kind of help us get there.
Right. I think, yeah, you're right. Legislation, can also play a big role. FCC can play a big role also with a lot of other things. People may not like end of life, that, hey, this is my device, I should be able to use it forever. But no, once it stops getting updated, either it disconnects from the internet, it doesn't work with the internet, or it just stops working, you're going by. You cannot keep driving your car, which cannot pass any inspections, right? You cannot live in a house, which cannot pass inspection. It should not be different, because our lives are so dependent on these. Everything is connected, So let's just move on from here. Let's talk about another topic that we want to discuss today, that is yuboot. That is kind of known very well within the developer community, but let's just simplify it in just, everyday jargon. Try to explain what exactly it is and how it is being used.
Yeah, so yuboot is a bootloader that is responsible in embedded platforms and systems, often many of which run Linux. When a chip powers on, and oftentimes these processors, we refer to them as system-on-a-chip devices. When it powers on, the bootloader is responsible for initializing all the hardware and kind of getting everything ready so that we can hand off execution to our operating system. And yuboot is a really popular option for this type of bootloader. It's been around for almost 20 years now. And perhaps some of the reasons for its popularity are, not only its maturity and regular release cycles and things like that, but also that the silicon vendors making those system-on-a-chip devices are including it in their board support packages and SDKs. So as you mentioned earlier, that there's kind of always this push for getting to the next product, releasing the next one. So to decrease time to market, oftentimes this yuboot bootloader will be integrated into the board support package, so product developers can take the existing support, integrate it into their product, and move on and focus on the attributes of their product that kind of differentiate it in the market. And this is kind of where I see problems arising sometimes, because when you adopt software, whether open source or proprietary, that's a form of technical debt. If you don't understand it very well, or you don't invest into understanding how it integrates into your system and make sure that it's acceptable, then you might have functional risks. Conversely, if you don't analyze its security properties and whether its security model matches that of your product, then you might have security debt, which you have to pay off in terms of investing time and inspection and editing kind of code and things like that.
When you mention open source, I just want to bring two things forth. As you also mentioned, just because you're open source, using open source, that doesn't mean you don't have any technical debt. also, just because you're open source doesn't mean it's fully secure. Bugs are part of software development process, and those bugs are the ones that became security hole. So, so just because you're using open source, if you're not patching it, it doesn't really matter. And Equifax is a very good example, not to blame them, but these things happen. And so that is not going to solve the problem, just by saying that, hey, I'm using open source, I'm good. Even if you look at yuboot, there are, vulnerabilities in every piece of code. So can you talk about, even in yuboot, what kind of vulnerabilities can be there or are there, and how they can be mitigated? Because the problem with the security is it's a cat and mouse game. You have to be right 100 times. The bad guy has to be right only once. That's all it takes. So talk about that.
Yeah, and that's a really great point too about open source software does not come without a cost. When you are a product vendor integrating yuboot into your product, you have to kind of take it on and own it to keep up to date with, what are the recent vulnerabilities that are published. There were some network-based vulnerabilities somewhat recently that could allow for remote code execution. So the types of vulnerabilities that could arise in yuboot are not necessarily those which are like coding bugs in the traditional vulnerability sense, but they may be more nuanced in terms of, such and such product may be exposed out in the wild, in not attended. For instance, let's say we have some sort of gateway device on a smart neighborhood network, right? And someone can go and tamper with it, and they might have physical access. Well, if the product vendor didn't do due diligence in ensuring that privileged console interfaces, which is commonly enabled by default in yuboot, if they didn't restrict that or restrict the command sets that are available in it, it may be the case that compromising that entire device could be just a simple matter of hitching up, connecting a little serial port connector to it. In my recent work on our NCC Group's blog, we demonstrated on a smart speaker how one could bypass some of the protections that a product vendor attempted to introduce by using an I2C bus, a communications interface. So really, in terms of yuboot, there's kind of the physical threats sometimes in terms of securing the different ways that input and output flow through the system. There could be network-based threats if the device is one that, if it fails to boot, it then attempts to reach out to a server. That might have been left in from development cycles where they were using that to reflash the system. And another interesting area is people are trying to get what they call secure boot flows, or make it so that a platform is resilient to, once it is compromised, that an attacker cannot install malicious software. And the bootloader is an interesting place to put your malicious software, and sometimes companies are failing to protect that, even if they are trying to make it so that you can't install malicious applications or things like that on the device. So there's a lot of different areas where security risks can arise that may not necessarily even be just to security vulnerabilities in the upstream code, but rather a more nuanced issue where the vendor hasn't thought about, what are our security expectations and what functionality in yuboot do we have enabled, and is there a mismatch?
Can you talk about what are the dangers, what are the real, because sometimes people, what happens is they don't even realize the risk. And there is another problem with security, especially for businesses, can be that to them, business continuity is important. They don't want to take their services down for half an hour because they knew they will lose. But security is something, if is compromised, then so that never becomes priority. But there are a lot of risks. That's why we have fire alarms in our houses, or some people also have fire extinguishers, just to kind of mitigate. So can you talk about the dangers that are there that users, vendors, and developers should be aware of so that they can prioritize security?
Yeah, it's a great question. So some of the risks are oftentimes we see devices that lack proper authentication or authorization. So a device deployed in the field or exposed to the internet, even perhaps unintentionally, could just be compromised as a result of just kind of chance and opportunity. So that someone could bring it into part of a botnet. So just leaving software exposed and vulnerable. Your device, your property, using your internet connection may be used for illicit purposes. Now, are you liable for that? So certainly privacy risks. So if someone is able to abuse some exposure in a device to compromise it and put malicious software on it, can that be used to spy on individuals? As we think about devices with speakers and microphones and image sensors and things like that. So the risks can kind of span both from abusing the very functionality that the device is intended for to it's just a computing resource and can be used to launch attacks elsewhere. And there's certainly liabilities and financial damage. We certainly don't want our smart devices that are helping us in ways to become the point by which an attacker pivots into a network and conducts further bigger scale attacks.
Right. I think there are so many possibilities of how this can be. We have to create another season of Black Mirror to or Mr. Robot to basically understand because that's beyond our imagination how it can be. And as we are using more and more of these devices, it's really, really dangerous. Now, when we do look at it, I see as a supply chain problem. There are vendors involved, developers involved. So can you talk about what role each of them play or can play to ensure security so that they do know that where does the buck stop? Because every time it's like, hey, that's not my problem.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually a huge problem that I encounter when helping the customers that I work for to audit their products is where it may be the case that a module is an embedded system of in itself that's integrated into a product that's developed by an original equipment manufacturer, an OEM, who then buys chips from a couple different silicon vendors who each provide their own software. And they maybe take a fork of some open source software. So that's years and years old. So now you have kind of this accumulation of people who are not necessarily owning the risks as they arise, whether they be vulnerabilities that require patching or simply just not having the expertise or maybe not even sharing source code so for someone to inspect. So I mean, at some level, I think we need to kind of better understand how suppliers of modules and things like that can better understand how their customers are using and integrating these and helping their customers tailor the usage to fit the threat models in the products they're integrating. When we purchase silicon and from chip vendors, their duty is to help you use that chip and get off the ground with your design. But perhaps we can maybe figure out ways to have them play a little bit more of a role in terms of keeping software development kits up to date and board support packages was traditionally been a huge problem where they're always very out of date. Once the chip works and it hits market, it's frozen. It doesn't receive updates anymore. So perhaps engaging third parties to help kind of keep those updated, have the vulnerabilities that come out and published to the CVE databases kind of flagged. So there's definitely a lot to do there, and there's a lot of technical and security debt that I think if anyone had a silver bullet, we would be in a lot better shape.
Right, and then there's one more problem. The problem is don't fix it if it's not broken, because in the field, if you push an update, it might break some functionality, So it's better, it's working, don't touch it. That is also there. Now, if I'm not wrong, you are also creator of Depth Charge, which is a free toolkit intended to help professionals to quickly find security holes in any kind of modification that they made to the yuboot bootloader. Tell a bit about what drove you to create this, and if you can also explain how it really works, and third part, who is using it.
In my role as a security consultant, and actually, as an engineer prior to that, I've been looking at yuboot and working with it in different ways for almost 10 years. And I often see that a lot of similar common problems keep arising in terms of people not, disabling functionality that they don't even realize is there, or making modifications that aren't really consistent with the security, posture that they're looking for. And after seeing kind of these common patterns of kind of the gotchas that I would encounter, I decided that I wanted to kind of try to aggregate all that knowledge that I've accumulated into an open source framework and a tool so that we kind of have, security professionals and researchers kind of have a common way to, go about demonstrating these issues and bringing them to vendors. And for us, I mean, it becomes kind of a common methodology and a way for us to work more efficiently and effectively. Because to be honest, yuboot isn't necessarily the thing we want to compromise, but rather it is the means to our end to, get root on a Linux device so that we can further instrument it and then start looking for the real high impact issues, the things that are like the remotely accessible vulnerabilities. So oftentimes kind of hacking yuboot, so to speak, is kind of just our first step towards instrumenting a platform for deeper security analysis and audits. So I created the depth charge toolkit to help me kind of figure out how we can work more effectively and efficiently to perform security audits of yuboot-based systems, or systems that include yuboot.
Can you talk about who is using it or what kind of use cases it's being used?
Sure. So right now the use case is largely security professionals and researchers, ourselves at NCC Group, when we're doing security audits. So fellow researchers, and I've talked to some trainers to kind of help other people kind of start getting eyes on it and figuring out how we can improve it, extend it, and integrate it into workflows where we're doing research on embedded systems. Now in January timeframe, I'm looking to begin publishing some additional functionality that make depth charge useful to developers and product vendors. I would like to integrate some functionality to let them kind of scan their configurations and some of the settings that they're using and kind of alert them in a configuration checker kind of way to say, hey, you've included this command or this functionality with this functionality, and those don't really necessarily make sense, or they may increase your attack surface rather. So I'm trying to actually, not only have the kind of the attack-oriented side of the security professionals, but also kind of the defenders. And I think that's kind of the marriage of those two, us working together, I think is ultimately what we need for, to increase the security posture of products in general.
And since the project is open source, it's available on GitHub. Anybody can use it. It's not like what kind of community are you thinking of building around it, or do you think that since the project solves a specific problem, you're content with the community that is already there?
I'm always happy to kind of see how a community grows and evolves organically. Currently, I would say it's more of the security researchers and consultants. And the reason why I kind of did it as a separate project rather than trying to propose changes to the upstream yuboot code is because this will give us a little bit room to kick ideas around and kind of be more fluid with how we go about doing things. So the type of community I'm looking to kind of foster is that of people who are interested in security or just taking devices apart and tinkering with them and learning how they work. And I'm hoping that the toolkit will help them do that a little more efficiently and effectively so they can kind of focus on the really interesting bits of things. Myself, I'm someone who loves seeing old devices upcycled into something new and exciting. So kind of the kind of community I'd like to see is security people, people, maybe even product development teams that just want to kind of see how we do our work and what threats to be aware of. And then also people who just like to tinker and kind of hack with their devices in the old school sense of just kind of learning about them and playing with them, adding new functionality.
So we talked about, the whole problem. I do know that users mostly don't pay attention, but if you have some tips, for users who are using these smart devices, that something which is easy that they should just follow just to make sure that not only their home network, because these days everybody is working from home remotely, their kids are accessing everything from iPad so that it is safe. So do you have any tips that, hey, do these 2 or 3 things to make sure that you are safe and secure?
Sure. I'm going to try to deviate a little bit from the traditional advice that I always hear, because I think that some of the advice we've had in the past hasn't necessarily worked. So I guess I'll start with, as you integrate devices into your life, think about what would happen if it was hacked and what that would mean to you, and plan around that. So if you're hanging up security cameras in your home, you might not want someone to see you in the restroom or your bedroom, right? So maybe think about only focusing them on entrances and exits, for instance. Think about what would happen if this was hacked, and how can you mitigate or reduce the impact of that risk to you? So that'd be probably my first piece of advice. I think this next one, I guess, is a little bit of something people always hear is, don't reuse passwords and such. And the way I would recommend people to avoid that is there are some really great password manager products out there. that help you avoid reusing passwords. So you always have a unique one. But to even kind of go against the grain with some of the older advice, realistically, we as humans are very good at perhaps keeping documents in our safe. For most people, writing down a password and putting it into their safe is appropriate for home situations. Obviously don't do that at work and don't stick a note on your monitor. But if you have some important accounts like your bank accounts and things like that, it might be okay to put it into a locked safe so that you ensure that you're not reusing passwords. And I guess one more piece of advice is to think critically about when you're purchasing a product, about what those security claims are. Nothing is black and white, simple, and if something is claiming to have absolute security, look at it critically and try to think about how much is this company likely invested given the cost of the product. It's not necessarily the case that more expensive means better security, but if a device is very, very low cost, they've had to make those cost cutting decisions somewhere, and whether it's security, maybe it's something you want to do a little research on and see if there's hacker conferences talking about how they hacked the device or things like that.
No, there are some good advice. When you were mentioning that install a camera somewhere, that if it is hacked, I would say that assume that it is already hacked. Because the fact is, in most cases, some of these companies, today also there was a story that they share that information with law enforcement authorities. Sometimes they use it for their own internal purpose. So please assume that it is already hacked. You're always being watched. So place it where you are safe. Number two, when you talk about the passwords, I was talking to somebody and they were also saying was that sometimes we also use information like, your mom's name, your date of birth, where you're born. They said make a set of fake information that is not authentic. Use that information, not your real one, because sometimes they also use that information to verify who you are and then compromise through all social engineering. And the third thing that you mentioned was when you're buying something, always ask, because even if you know it's secure and if you go ask, the vendor will get the message that people are asking about it. So it will become a critical piece of their marketing that we have to talk about it because people are asking about it. So we can do a little bit about it, which can improve security, because there will be a time where our life will depend on it. And if you're a Tesla driver, you do know that your life depends on this embedded. I look at Tesla cars as IoT on wheels. So that is there. Jon, thank you so much for taking time out today from your schedule and talk about this interesting topic, yuboot, embedded devices. People don't talk about embedded devices, but we are surrounded with embedded devices around us. So once again, thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to speak with you.